Hey there, welcome to the Diaries. Here I tell the stories that you will not find online, the stories that I collect from my neighbors and friends. Let's go.
The Sunday brunches started 3 months after the wedding. Though nobody had voted on them, nobody had suggested them. They simply arrived like a weather pattern that settles over a town and stays for years, becoming so familiar that people stop checking the forecast and just carry umbrellas in July out of muscle memory. Shirley called them family brunches, but the family was a loose constellation that seemed to expand and contract, depending on who in the condo complex had recently lost a spouse or needed to feel included in something warmer than cable television. And the restaurant was always the same, a place called the Garden Gate that tried to look like a cottage in the Cotswolds, but was actually a converted TGI Fridays off Route 9, with wisteria painted on the walls by someone who had only seen flowers in photographs, and a menu that featured Eggs Benedict in 6 variations, each one more architecturally unstable than the last. I knew the menu by heart because I had paid for it by heart, or rather by debit card, by credit card, by the slow hemorrhage of a savings account that I had built during my single years in Brooklyn when I illustrated textbooks for $50 a page and ate ramen with real vegetables, because I was extravagant, because I was young, because I did not yet understand that money was not a river but a reservoir, and that some people would spend their whole lives building pumps to drain yours. I was 35. Donnie was 37. We had met at a gallery opening in Soho that was actually a tech company's attempt to seem cultured. He was there for the free wine, and I was there because a friend had installed a series of charcoal drawings in the back room, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing, about the way the air conditioning smelled like wet metal, about how neither of us knew anyone else there, and somehow that nothing became a habit, then a relationship, then a marriage that felt less like a decision and more like a current that had carried us both to the same sandbar and we were too tired to swim any further. Donnie was kind. That was the word I used then, and the word I still use, though now it carries a different weight, like a stone that was once smooth and is now chipped at the edges. He was kind in the way of a person who has never been asked to be brave. He was an IT specialist for a logistics firm in White Plains. He fixed servers. He spoke the language of backup drives and firewall protocols. And when something in the physical world broke, a faucet, a heart, a boundary, he looked at it with the same expression he used for a corrupted file. A gentle, baffled sorrow, as if the damage were theoretical and might resolve itself if he simply waited long enough. Shirley was 68, a widow, a former accountant for a dental supply company, and she had the particular precision of someone who spent 30 years making numbers behave while her own life refused to add up. She lived in a 2-bedroom condo in Yonkers with Kathy, Donnie's younger sister, who was 33 and unemployed, though between opportunities was the phrase Shirley used, drawing out the syllables like they were made of something precious, like gold leaf. Kathy was between opportunities the way a person standing in a doorway is between rooms, neither inside nor out, just occupying the threshold indefinitely, waiting for someone to either push her through or pull her back. She had a degree in communications from a state school and a series of ex-boyfriends who had left her with nothing but a collection of hoodies and a habit of sighing loudly during commercials. On Sundays, she wore the hoodies to brunch, the sleeves pulled over her hands, and she ordered the most expensive item on the menu, the lobster Benedict, even though she never finished it, pushing the half-eaten plate toward the center of the table like an offering that had been rejected by the gods. The neighbor friends rotated. There was Mrs. Gable from 4B, who talked about her hip replacement in granular detail. There was Mr. and Mrs. Chen, who smiled politely and split a single entree. There was a woman named Barbara who had once been Shirley's coworker and now existed in a state of permanent indignation about the price of heating oil. They were not my friends. They were not Donnie's friends. They were Shirley's audience, her chorus, the extra bodies that made the table feel like an event rather than a ritual, and they all understood, without ever being told, that the bill was not a shared responsibility, but a donation, a tithe, paid by the youngest woman at the table because she had the most to prove. I was the illustrator. I was the artist. I was the one who worked from home in yoga pants, and therefore, in Shirley's cosmology, did not really work at all. Donnie never paid. He forgot his wallet with the consistency of a season, like autumn leaves or spring pollen, and when he did remember it, he had just transferred funds to his brokerage account, or his credit card was acting weird, or he would look at me with those kind eyes and say, "Can you get this one, babe? I'll grab the next one," knowing there would never be a next one, knowing that the words were just a placeholder for the silence that would follow. And I paid. I paid because Shirley would post the photos before we even reached the parking lot, her phone already out, her thumbs moving with the speed of a teenager, uploading images of the table, the food, the smiling faces, captioning them, "My wonderful family," or "Sunday blessings," or "So grateful for these moments." And I would see the notifications pop up on my own phone, the little red hearts accumulating from neighbors and distant cousins, and I would feel the peculiar suffocation of being seen and erased simultaneously, of becoming a character in a story that was not my own, and I was afraid. This is the part I am ashamed to write, the part that sticks in my throat like a fishbone, that if I stopped paying, if I let the bill sit on the table like an unanswered letter, Shirley would tell someone, would post something, would let the world know that Meg was greedy, that Meg was selfish, that Meg did not understand the meaning of family, and the world would believe her. The world always believes the mother-in-law. The world looks at a 35-year-old woman with paint under her fingernails and sees a girl who has not yet learned to give. 3 years, 156 brunches, though some were holidays that Shirley promoted to special occasions, and therefore required a larger group, a bigger table, a more expensive restaurant. I started keeping the receipts in a shoebox under my desk, not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I needed to know. I needed to see the numbers in black ink, the steady accumulation of zeros, the proof that I was not imagining the weight of this, that it was not a sensitivity or a flaw in my character, but a measurable, quantifiable fact. The shoebox filled. I moved to a file folder. The file folder grew thick, laminated with the particular gloss of thermal paper, and sometimes at night, when Donnie was asleep, I would spread them on the bedroom floor and arrange them in chronological order, running my fingers over the dates, feeling the texture of the paper, the way it turned brittle at the edges, and I would calculate the total in my head, not with a calculator, not with a pen, but slowly, deliberately, like a prayer or a penance, adding the columns until I reached the number that sat behind my eyes like a second pupil, $14,847. Not a fortune, not a life, but enough for a down payment on a studio, enough for a year of health insurance, enough for a dragon's cave, though I did not know that yet. The phone rang on a Tuesday. I was working on a spread for a picture book about a hedgehog who learns to share, which is the kind of story that pays the bills but makes you question the purpose of narrative, and I let it go to voicemail because the light was good, and I was in the middle of a wash of cerulean that needed to be laid down before it dried. When I listened to the message, the voice was bright, professionally warm, the voice of a woman who had been trained to sound like she cared about your ovaries, and she said, "Hi, Meg. This is Dr." Patel's office at the Northern Westchester Fertility Center. Just calling to confirm your hormone stimulation appointment for Thursday at 10 a.m. and to remind you that you'll need to arrange for someone to drive you home after the retrieval, as you will be under mild sedation. We're so excited to have you as part of our donor program. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. I listened to the message 3 times. Then I called back. The receptionist was the same woman, the same brightness, and she confirmed my name, my date of birth, my social security number, all of which were correct, all of which had been provided by someone who knew me well enough to know these things, but not well enough to know that I had never expressed a desire to sell pieces of my body to strangers. I asked how I had been enrolled. She said a family member had called on my behalf, had filled out the preliminary paperwork, had explained that I was eager to help couples in need, and that the compensation would be a nice supplement to my irregular income. The words were like a slap delivered through a silk glove. Irregular income. As if my work were a heartbeat that skipped, a engine that misfired, rather than a career that simply did not fit into the square boxes of Shirley's understanding. I hung up. I sat at my desk. The cerulean wash had dried into a crackled, useless skin, and I stared at the way the pigment had pulled away from the paper like a scab, and I thought about my body, about the eggs that were apparently not mine, but the family's, communal property, like the good silver or the timeshare in Myrtle Beach. I thought about the hormones I would have injected, the needles, the bloating, the retrieval, the anesthesia, all of it arranged without my knowledge by a woman who thought of me as a resource rather than a person, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of vertigo, as if the floor of my life had tilted and I were sliding toward an edge I had not known was there. Donnie came home at 6:30. He smelled like the office, like recycled air and the faint ozone of server rooms, and he kissed my cheek and asked what was for dinner, and I played him the voicemail. I watched his face as he listened, watched the kind eyes flicker, watched his mouth tighten and then relax, the way it always relaxed, because Donnie's face was a shoreline that had learned to erode rather than resist. He set the phone down carefully, as if it were made of something explosive. "Mom," he said. It was not a question. She called them. She signed me up. She told them I wanted money. He stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, which was thinning in a way that made him look older than 37, that gave him the appearance of a boy who had been aged by worry rather than time. She probably thought she was helping. You know how she gets. She sees those ads, the compensation, and she knows your work is irregular? I was going to say unpredictable, the seasonality, the way publishers. She told them I needed the money, Donnie. She told them I wasn't using my eggs, as if their milk going bad in the fridge. He sat down. He sat down heavily, the way he did when a server crashed. When the problem was too big for a reboot and required something more fundamental, something he did not know how to provide. "I'll talk to her," he said. "I'll tell her it was too much, that she crossed a line. You'll tell her. And then what? And then she'll apologize. She'll cry. You know she cries, Meg. She can't help it. She's lonely. She's widowed. She doesn't have boundaries. She doesn't have a sense that I am a separate person from her son, from her family, from her need for a grandchild she can post on Facebook." He looked at me then, and I saw it. The flicker of something that was not kindness but calculation, the quick arithmetic of a man who has learned that peace is cheaper than justice. "She wants a granddaughter," he said quietly. "She talks about it all the time. She sees her friends with grandchildren, and she has Kathy. Kathy is 33. Kathy lives in her house. Kathy is between opportunities. Why isn't Kathy donating her eggs? Kathy's not. Kathy's sensitive. She's had a hard time. You know that. And I haven't? He didn't answer. He stood up and went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stared into it, as if the answer might be on a shelf behind the yogurt, and I watched him from the doorway, watched his shoulders hunch, watched him choose the path of least resistance because that was the only path he had ever walked, and I felt the anger arrive then, not hot but cold. A glacier calving into a sea that had been still for too long. He did talk to her. He called that night, and I heard his voice through the bedroom wall, low and conciliatory, the voice of a diplomat negotiating a treaty he knows he will lose. And then I heard the rise of Shirley's voice, the wounded tremolo, and then the silence, and then the footsteps. And Donnie came into the room with the look of a man who has been asked to carry something too heavy and has agreed anyway. "She's crying," he said. "I know. She said she only wanted to help. She said she thought you'd be happy if you knew how much good you'd be doing." "And the money. Did you cancel the appointment?" He hesitated. The hesitation was a complete sentence, a novel, a history of our marriage in a single breath. She said if you don't want to do it, that's fine. But she asked me to ask you, to really think about it. Because she wants a grandchild so much, Meg. She wants it more than anything. And if we aren't going to give her one, if you're not ready, then maybe this is a way to give her something. A connection. A biological connection, even if it's not ours. She said she dreams about it. She dreams about holding a baby. I looked at him. I looked at this man I had married, this kind man, this 37-year-old boy, and I saw that he was not weak. Not exactly. Not in the way that villains are weak in stories. He was comfortable. He had found a shape that fit him, a life where he was never required to be the villain or the hero, only the mediator, the translator, the soft voice that said, "I'll talk to her," and then returned with nothing but more softness, more negotiation, more of the same slow erosion. And I understood, with a clarity that made my hands tremble, that he would not cancel the appointment. He would not draw a line. He would let the clinic call again and again, and he would tell me to really think about it, and the thinking would become a pressure, and the pressure would become a norm. And one day I would find myself in a paper gown with a needle in my arm, because it was easier than explaining to the world why I had said no. I said nothing. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to Donnie breathe, the slow rhythm of a man who has already forgiven himself for what he has not yet done, and I thought about the shoebox under my desk, the file folder, the numbers. I thought about the restaurant, the painted wisteria, the way Shirley waved the rolled-up receipt like a conductor's baton, and I knew that the next brunch was in 5 days, and that I would go, and that something would happen, or nothing would happen, and either way I would carry it inside me like a stone. I printed the receipts on Thursday. I took them to a copy shop in the city, a place that smelled like toner and desperation, and I asked them to bind them into a single document, a spiral-bound report with a clear plastic cover, the kind of thing you present at a deposition or a board meeting, the kind of thing that says, "This is not a feeling, this is a fact." The woman behind the counter looked at the stack and asked if it was for a tax audit, and I said, "Something like that," and she nodded as if she understood, as if she had bound 1,000 documents like this, 1,000 silent accusations made legible by collation and lamination. I carried it home on the train, the spiral binding digging into my palm, and I did not open it. I did not need to. I knew every page, every date, every total, every restaurant where I had bought Shirley's approval, one overpriced eggs Benedict at a time. Sunday arrived with the inevitability of weather. The sky was a low, gray lid, the kind of sky that presses down on the suburbs and makes everything feel smaller, closer, as if the world were a room with the windows closed. I dressed carefully. I wore a navy blue dress that I had bought for a gallery opening years ago, a dress that made me feel like a version of myself I had almost forgotten, a woman who stood in rooms and talked about color theory and the architecture of narrative, rather than a woman who calculated the tip before the appetizers arrived. I put the bound receipts in my bag. It was heavy, heavier than paper should be, as if the ink had absorbed something from my hands, some residue of resentment that had weight and mass. The garden gate was crowded with the post-church crowd, families with children who had already begun to melt down, couples who ate in silence, a layer of noise that sat over everything like fog. Shirley had secured the round table in the back, the one by the fake fireplace, and she was already seated when Donnie and I arrived, already holding court, already mid-anecdote about the condo board and the new recycling rules. Kathy was there, in a hoodie I recognized as belonging to a former boyfriend, the sleeves pulled down to her knuckles. Mrs. Gable was there, and Barbara, and a man I did not know, a neighbor from the new building, someone Shirley had adopted because he was single, and therefore in need of her particular brand of maternal colonization. Meg, Shirley called, as if she had not seen me in years rather than days, as if my arrival were a gift she had not expected. You look lovely. So professional. Are you expecting a client? Illustrators don't have clients, Mom, Donnie said, pulling out my chair for me, the gesture automatic, the chivalry of a man who has learned the moves without understanding the meaning. They have publishers. Same thing, Shirley said, waving her hand. Everyone's selling something. Now, I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of Prosecco. We're celebrating. Celebrating? I asked. The word felt dangerous in my mouth, a coin with an unknown face. Barbara's daughter got engaged. To a dentist. Can you imagine? A dentist. They'll never want for anything. The Prosecco arrived. The glasses were filled. Shirley made a toast. Something about love and family and the importance of sticking together. And everyone drank. And I watched the bubbles rise in my glass, watched them catch the light from the fake fireplace, and I thought about how bubbles are just air trapped in liquid, how they look solid but are nothing, how they rise and then vanish, and I wondered if that was a metaphor or just a fact, and whether the difference mattered anymore. The food came. Kathy ordered the lobster Benedict, as always. Shirley had the classic with extra hollandaise, because life is short and I'm not getting any thinner. Donnie had the corned beef hash, which he would eat slowly, methodically, cutting each bite into the same size, a habit left over from a childhood where meals were performances and precision was safety. The neighbor from the new building talked about his job in commercial real estate, and Shirley listened with the intensity of a woman who was already planning how to fit him into her narrative, and Mrs. Gable described her hip in new and horrifying detail, and Barbara complained about the heating oil, and I sat with the bound receipts in my bag, my hand resting on them, feeling the spiral binding through the leather, and I waited. I waited for the right moment, but the right moment never came. There was no pause in the conversation, no opening, no dramatic silence where the music swelled and the camera pushed in. There was only the steady drone of Shirley's voice, the clink of silver on porcelain, the gradual accumulation of empty plates, and then the waiter appeared with the check. The little leather folder placed on the table with the delicacy of a man who knows he is delivering bad news. It sat there. It sat there for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, while Shirley talked about Barbara's daughter's wedding colors, while Kathy scrolled through her phone, while Donnie looked at the folder and then looked at me, and then looked away. The kind eyes finding something fascinating in the middle distance, and I understood that this was the moment. Not because it was right, but because it was the only one I would get. I pulled the bound receipts from my bag. I set them on the table. The clear plastic cover caught the light, and Shirley's voice faltered just for a second, a needle skipping on a record. And then she looked at it, looked at me, and her expression was not confusion, but something else, something older and more practiced, the look of a woman who has been challenged before and has always won. "What is this?" she asked, and her voice was still bright, still maternal, but there was an edge to it now, a wire beneath the silk. 3 years, I said. My voice was steady. I did not recognize it. 156 brunches. $14,847. That's what I've paid for these Sunday blessings, Shirley. That's what I've paid for the Facebook posts. The table went quiet. Not silent. There was still the noise of the restaurant, the other tables, the kitchen. But our table, our little island, went still. Kathy looked up from her phone. Mrs. Gable's mouth opened slightly. Barbara leaned forward, her eyes bright with the terrible joy of witnessing something she could later recount in detail. Shirley picked up the document. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the spiral binding, the plastic cover. Then she began to roll it. She rolled it tightly, methodically, her fingers working with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years making dental supply numbers behave. And when she had finished, she held it up, a paper tube, and she began to wave it like a conductor's baton, a slow, rhythmic arc through the air. "Are you keeping a dossier on me?" she asked. Her voice was light, almost playful, but the words were sharp, each one a tooth. "Is that what this is? A dossier? Are you investigating your own family, Meg?" "Surely, because that's what this looks like. It looks like someone who has been watching and waiting and collecting evidence, like a lawyer, like a prosecutor. Is that what you think we are? A case to be tried?" Donnie reached for the tube. His hand was shaking. I saw it clearly, the tremor in his fingers, the way his kind eyes had gone wide and wet, not with tears but with the precursor to tears, the stress response of a man who has never learned to tolerate conflict. "Mom," he said. "Mom, give me that. Let's just, let's talk about this. Let's not make a scene." "You're making a scene," Shirley said, and she pulled the tube away from him, raised it higher, and then brought it down, quick and sharp, across his nose. It was not a hard blow. The paper was light, the tube was hollow, but the sound was unmistakable, a hollow thwack, and Donnie flinched, his hands flying to his face, and then he made a sound I had never heard from him before, a high, broken whimper that was not the sound of a man in pain, but of a child in distress, a 37-year-old boy who had been hit by his mother in a restaurant full of strangers, and he began to cry. Not sobbing, not dramatic, just tears, streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking, his hands still pressed to his nose, and I looked at him, at this man I had married, and I felt something break inside me, not my heart, but something adjacent to it, some structure I had built to hold my pity and my patience and my hope, and it broke, and what came out was not sorrow, but laughter. I laughed. It came from low in my chest, from my diaphragm, from a place that had been holding its breath for 3 years, and it was not a happy sound. It was bitter, and it was nervous, and it tasted like copper and rust, but it was real. It was mine. It was a sound that belonged to me, and not to Shirley's Facebook page, not to the wonderful family, not to the Sunday blessings. I laughed, and the table stared, and Shirley stared, her conductor's baton frozen in midair, and I kept laughing, and I realized that I was crying too. That the laughter and the tears were the same thing, two currents running through the same river, and I did not care. I did not care what the neighbors thought. I did not care what Barbara would say at the next condo meeting. I cared about the sound of my own voice, the unfamiliar shape of it, the way it filled the room and pushed back against the painted wisteria and the fake fireplace, and the weight of all those Sundays. I stood up. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that had not already been said by the receipts, by the laughter, by the tears on Donnie's face that he was not wiping away because his hands were still covering his nose. I picked up my bag, and I walked toward the door, and I heard Shirley say something behind me, something about ungratefulness, about family, about how she had only ever wanted to love me. But her voice was distant, already fading, already becoming part of the background noise of a life I was no longer required to inhabit. I walked out into the parking lot. The sky was still gray, pressing down, but the air was cold and it smelled like asphalt and rain, and I took a deep breath of it, and then another. And I realized I was shaking, my whole body vibrating with the aftermath of the laughter, and I got into my car, and I drove. I drove without thinking about where I was going, without a destination, just following the road as it curved away from the garden gate, away from Route 9, away from Yonkers and the condo and the life that had been built on my silence. I drove for an hour, maybe two, until I found myself in a town I did not know, a place with a coffee shop and a used bookstore, and a bench by a river that was the color of slate. And I sat on the bench, and I watched the water move, and I tried to feel something other than the echo of the laughter. It was only when the sun began to set, when the gray sky turned the color of a bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, that I realized I had left my jacket. It was a good jacket, a wool coat I had bought in Brooklyn, navy blue with buttons that were real horn, and I had left it on the back of the chair at the garden gate. And I thought about going back for it, about walking into that restaurant again, about facing Shirley and Donnie and the spilled Prosecco and the rolled-up receipts, and I could not do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I found a motel. It was the kind of place that rents by the week, that smells like industrial cleaner and old dreams, and I paid for one night with cash I had in my wallet, $40 left over from a grocery run, and I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of traffic through the thin walls, and I thought about the eggs, about the clinic, about the hormone shots I would not be taking, and I felt a strange hollow freedom, like a tooth that has been extracted. The absence of pain so unfamiliar that it almost feels like a new kind of pain. I did not call Donnie. He did not call me. The silence between us was not angry. It was not anything. It was the silence of two people who have finally run out of things to pretend, and there is a relief in that, a terrible, lonely relief. Like the moment after a storm when the sky clears and you see the damage, and you know that nothing will ever be the same, but at least the waiting is over. I stayed in the motel for 3 days. I drew on the notepad by the phone, little sketches of dragons and caves and piles of gold that looked like mountains, and on the third day I called a friend from Brooklyn, a woman named Elena who had once been my roommate and was now a real estate agent in Queens, and I asked if I could stay with her for a while. And she said yes. She said, "Of course." She said, "I've been waiting for this call." And I did not ask what she meant. I drove to Queens. I left the motel room with its industrial cleaner and its dragon sketches, and I started again. But I had to go back. Not to stay, not to reconcile, but to get my things, my clothes, my art supplies, the boxes of original illustrations that were worth more to me than anything in the bank. And so a week after the brunch, a week after the laughter and the paper tube and the tears, I drove back to the house. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Donnie would be at work. Shirley would be at her condo. Kathy would be somewhere. I had a key. I let myself in. The house was quiet. It smelled the same, like the vanilla candles Shirley liked and the faint, permanent scent of old carpet, and I walked through the living room, past the couch where Donnie watched sports he did not care about, past the dining table where we had eaten 1,000 silent dinners, and into the bedroom to get my suitcase. I packed quickly, mechanically, not thinking about the memories attached to each object, the sweater Donnie had bought me for a birthday, the earrings I had worn to our wedding, the sketchbook with the first drawing of the hedgehog who learned to share. I packed them all. I would sort them later. I would decide what to keep and what to discard when I had the distance to see them clearly. I was zipping the suitcase when I heard a sound from the kitchen, a spoon against porcelain, a soft rhythmic clink. I should have left. I should have walked out the door with my suitcase and my silence and never looked back. But I did not. I walked down the hall, past the bathroom with the towels folded in the way Shirley had taught me, past the guest room that was never used, and I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I saw them. Donnie was sitting at the kitchen table. He was still in his work clothes, the button-down shirt with the logo of the logistics firm, the khakis that he bought in bulk online, but his tie was loosened and his hair was mussed, and he was sitting very still, very straight, like a child waiting for permission to leave the table. Shirley stood beside him. She was wearing an apron, a floral thing with ruffles, and she held a bowl of soup, chicken noodle from the look of it. The kind that comes from a can, but has been doctored with extra vegetables and love, or the performance of love. And she was feeding him. She dipped the spoon into the bowl. She blew on it, gently, the way you blow on soup for a child, and she held it to his lips, and he opened his mouth, and he took it. He swallowed. He did not look at her. He looked at the table, at the pattern of the wood grain, at a spot somewhere in the middle distance, and she dipped the spoon again, and she blew again, and she fed him again, and he was 37 years old, and he was letting his mother feed him soup with a spoon, and neither of them saw me. I watched them. I watched for a minute, maybe two, time stretching and compressing in the way it does when you are witnessing something that should be private, but is also, somehow, the answer to a question you have been asking for years. I watched Shirley's face, the concentration, the tenderness, the absolute certainty that this was her role, that this was what she had been put on earth to do. And I watched Donnie's face, the blankness, the surrender, the profound and total comfort of being cared for, of being small, of being a child in a world that had never asked him to be a man. And I felt no anger. I waited for it. I searched for it. I tried to summon the rage that had carried me out of the garden gate. But it was not there. In its place was something colder and clearer, something like understanding, or maybe just the absence of illusion. I saw Donnie clearly for the first time, not as a failed husband, not as a weak man, not as a boy who could not stand up to his mother, but as a person who had made a choice. He was happy. He was comfortable. This was not cowardice. This was not pathology. This was a man who had looked at the world and seen that it required hardness and boundary drawing and the painful work of becoming an individual, and he had chosen, instead, to remain in the warmth of his mother's orbit, to be fed and forgiven and managed, to trade autonomy for soup, for the spoon, for the certainty that he would never be asked to carry anything heavier than his own empty bowl. I stepped back from the doorway. I picked up my suitcase. I walked out of the house, and I closed the door quietly, gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping child. And I got into my car, and I drove to Queens, and I did not cry. I did not laugh. I simply drove, and the city rose around me, the buildings getting taller, the streets getting denser, and I felt myself expanding into the space that had been opened up by my absence from that kitchen, by my refusal to be the one who paid for the soup, who paid for the spoon, who paid for the performance of family that had cost me $14,847, and so much more that I would spend years calculating. Elena's apartment was small, a one-bedroom in Astoria that she had converted into a two-bedroom by partitioning the living room with a bookshelf and a curtain, and my space was the half with the window that looked out onto the street, the traffic, the life of the city moving below like a river. She did not ask me what happened. She made tea. She let me sit in silence. And after a week, when I had slept enough to stop dreaming of paper tubes and soup spoons, I opened my sketchbook, and I began to draw. I drew a dragon. Not a fierce dragon, not a Smaug or a St. George victim, but a dragon who was tired, a dragon with scales the color of old pennies and eyes that were not cruel, but simply wary, watchful. The eyes of a creature who has learned that the world is full of people who want something from you. I drew him in a cave, but the cave was not dark. It was warm. It was lit by the glow of his own hoard, not because the gold was beautiful, but because it was a wall, a barrier, a way to keep the cold out. And I drew the villagers, the little people with their pitchforks and their petitions, standing at the mouth of the cave and shouting about greed, about selfishness, about how the dragon had so much and shared so little. And I drew the dragon inside, not listening, not because he was cruel, but because he was building something, because every coin was a brick, every jewel a beam, and he was constructing a place where no one would knock on the door, where no one would ask for a loan till Friday, where no one would sign him up for programs he had not chosen or feed him soup he had not asked for. I wrote the words. I wrote them slowly, in the voice of the dragon, which was also my voice, which was the voice of anyone who has ever been called greedy for wanting to keep what is theirs. I wrote about the weight of gold, about how it is not the metal that is heavy, but the expectation, the obligation, the endless open palm of the world. I wrote about the silence of the cave, about how silence is not empty, but full, full of the absence of demands, full of the space to hear your own thoughts. I wrote about the villagers, about their good intentions, about their need, about the way need can become a weapon without ever meaning to, and I wrote about the dragon's choice, not to hoard out of avarice, but to hoard out of hope. The hope that one day the walls would be high enough, the door strong enough, that he could finally rest. The book took 6 months. I worked on it in Elena's apartment, in the mornings before she woke, in the evenings after she came home from showing houses to people who would never be satisfied, and she read the drafts as I finished them, and she cried, not dramatically but quietly, the way you cry when you see something true. She said, "This is not a children's book." And I said, "Yes, it is. It's just not only for children." And she nodded, because she understood, and she sent it to an agent she knew, a woman who represented picture books and literary fiction and did not see a contradiction between the two, and the agent read it, and she called me, and she said, "I don't know who will publish this, but I know someone has to." It was published by a small press in Brooklyn, a place that had made its reputation on books that were beautiful and strange and did not fit into the categories that the big publishers understood. They gave it a title, The Dragon Who Built a Cave. The art was in watercolor and ink, the dragon's scales done in layers of wash that took days to dry, the cave glowing with gold leaf that I applied myself, sitting at Elena's kitchen table with a tiny brush and a steady hand. The first print run was 5,000 copies. They sold out in 3 weeks. The second print run was 20,000. The New York Times reviewed it, not in the children's section but in the art section, calling it a meditation on boundary and selfhood disguised as a fable, and I read that sentence 100 times, not because it was flattering but because it was accurate, because someone had seen what I had made and understood that it was not a story about a dragon, but a story about the right to say no. It became a bestseller. Not a blockbuster, not a movie deal, but a quiet, persistent bestseller. The kind of book that people buy for their friends who are going through divorces, who are moving out of shared apartments, who are learning to say no for the first time. I got letters. I got emails. I got drawings from children who saw the dragon not as a villain but as a hero, and from adults who saw themselves in the villagers, in the open palms, in the need that had become a habit. I moved out of Elena's apartment. I found a studio in Brooklyn, a walk-up with a skylight and a radiator that clanked, and a landlord who only spoke to me about rent and never about my personal life. I built my own cave. I filled it with paper and paint and the silence that I had bought with my own hands, and it was not lonely. It was full. I did not see Donnie. I did not see Shirley. I heard things through the mutual friends we no longer shared, through the internet, through the strange, porous membrane of the modern world. I heard that Donnie had moved back into the condo with Shirley and Kathy, that he had taken over the guest room, that he was happy, that he had been promoted at the logistics firm but had asked to work from home, that Shirley still hosted brunches but now at the condo, with casseroles rather than restaurants, and that Donnie sat at the head of the table and carved the roast and paid for nothing because there was nothing to pay for. I heard that Kathy had found a job, part-time, at a pet store, and that she was dating a man who worked in commercial real estate, the neighbor from the new building, and that Shirley was planning the wedding. I heard these things, and I felt them move through me like water through a sieve, leaving nothing behind but a faint residue, the memory of a life that had once been mine, but was no longer, and I did not miss it. I did not miss him. I missed, sometimes, the idea of the marriage, the idea of the partner, the idea of someone who would sit across from me in the silence of my cave and not ask for anything. But I had learned that the idea was not the same as the reality, and that it was better to be alone in a cave you had built than to be accompanied in a house that was slowly draining you dry. A year after the book was published, I got a notification. It was a Facebook alert, a memory, a post from Shirley that had been shared by someone I had not thought about in months, and I clicked on it. Not because I wanted to, but because curiosity is a habit as hard to break as any other. And there it was. A photograph of the book, my book, on a table in the condo, next to a vase of flowers and a candle. The caption read, "My daughter-in-law finally found herself. I always believed in her. So proud of our Meg." I stared at the screen. The words were like a translation, a version of my life rendered into a language I did not speak, a narrative in which I was still a character, still our Meg, still belonging to the family that had tried to sell my eggs and feed my husband soup. I read the comments. "So talented. What a wonderful mother-in-law you are. Family support is everything." And I felt the old familiar suffocation, the pressure of being seen and erased, the weight of Shirley's ownership like a hand on my shoulder. But then I looked at the photograph again, at the book on the table, at the dragon on the cover with his wary eyes and his golden cave, and I realized that Shirley had bought the book. She had paid for it. With her own money, or Donnie's money, or Kathy's pet store wages, but she had paid for it, and she had read it, or at least looked at it, and she had seen the story of a dragon who refused to be called greedy, and she had understood it well enough to try to claim it as her own, to wrap it in the same narrative she had always used, the narrative of the wonderful family, the supportive mother-in-law, the Sunday blessings. I moved the cursor over the like button. I hovered there. The little thumb icon waited, patient, indifferent. I thought about pressing it. I thought about the satisfaction of the gesture, the small, sharp pleasure of appearing gracious, of playing the game one last time, of letting Shirley have her post and her comments and her belief that she had always believed in me. I thought about not pressing it, about letting the notification sit there unanswered, about the silence that would follow, the silence that was not empty but full, full of the absence of my participation, full of the space where my like would have been. I closed the laptop. I stood up. I walked to the window of my studio, the skylight dark with evening, the city lights beginning to bloom below like a field of artificial stars. I thought about the dragon in his cave, about the walls he had built, about the silence he had bought with his hoard, and I thought about the villagers, still standing at the mouth of the cave, still shouting, still kneading, still waving their open palms like conductors' batons, and I knew that the dragon could hear them. He could always hear them, but he did not have to answer. He did not have to come out. He did not have to pay for their brunch. Tomorrow, I thought. I'll decide tomorrow. And the thought was not a postponement. It was a choice. It was the first time I had ever given myself permission to wait, to hold the decision in my hand like a coin, feeling its weight, its texture, its temperature, and not having to spend it immediately. Tomorrow I would like the post, or I would not like the post, and either way it would be my decision, made in my cave, in my silence, with my own hand, and Shirley would never know the difference, but I would know. I would know that the like, if it came, was a gift, and not a tax. I would know that the silence, if it remained, was a wall, and not a wound. I made tea. I sat at my desk. I opened a new sketchbook, blank pages waiting like snow, and I began to draw, not a dragon this time, but a bird. A small, ordinary bird, building a nest, twig by twig, not because it was greedy, not because it was afraid, but because it was alive, and because the nest was necessary, and because the work of building it was the only work that mattered. The radiator clanked, the city hummed, the light from the skylight faded to black, and I drew in the dark, not needing to see, knowing the shapes by heart, knowing that tomorrow would come, and that I would decide then, and that the decision, whatever it was, would finally, truly, be mine.